Hello, this is Dr. Nunez. Welcome to the ACC 350 Exam 2 review. So, Exam 2 will cover chapters 3 and 5. The exam has four problems on it. Let's start our review with chapter 3, job costing. So, the first thing that you need to be able to do from chapter 3 is find the predetermined overhead rate. So we started out by determining a single plant-wide predetermined overhead rate. That predetermined overhead rate is based on Y over X, where Y is the total manufacturing overhead. So it's the dollar value of that total manufacturing overhead over the estimated total allocation base, or X. Now, Y, the total amount of the manufacturing overhead, is A plus BX, where A is the fixed component, so you got the fixed overhead, and B is the variable manufacturing overhead rate. And we multiply that variable rate B times X, which is the estimated allocation base. So the first objective is to get Y, which is that total manufacturing overhead. And we do it by putting the fixed overhead and the variable overhead together in this equation. We add them together and we end up with total manufacturing overhead. And then we use that rate to apply our overhead. So we can trace the materials, we can trace the labor, but we can't trace the overhead. So we have to assign overhead using this rate, this predetermined overhead rate. And the application of overhead looks the same in every exercise that we did it. It's the rate times the actual allocation base. The rate times the actual allocation base. Now, when we're asked to find the total job cost in Chapter 3, we add the materials that we can trace, the labor that we can trace, and we apply the overhead using the rate times the actual allocation base. So the total cost of the job is always going to have these three components. It's always going to be the materials plus the labor plus the overhead. The three of those things makes up the total job cost. And if we need a job cost per unit, just take that total divided by the number of units. There's some pretty good examples that you want to make sure you go back and work through. Exercise 3.3, 3.7, and then chapter 3 in class problem number 1. Now, we also looked at determining the job cost where you have two department rates. So instead of just a single plant-wide overhead rate, we had two department rates. And the way you find two rates is a lot like the way you find one rate. You know, you put some measure of the cost over some allocation base. And when you're using departmental rates, well, it's the department cost over the department allocation base, and you get the department rate. And then you use that rate in the same way. Trace the materials, trace the labor, and assign the overhead by multiplying the rate times the actual allocation base. And then we can find the total job cost again. It's just the materials that we can trace, plus the labor that we can trace, plus the overhead that we apply. Put them all together, and you've got a total cost for the job. You need a unit cost? Well, then divide by the number of units. And again, there's some pretty good examples that you want to go back and work through. Exercise 3.6, Chapter 3 in class problem number 1 and 2. So let's spend just a little bit of time at least looking at one of these exercises where you have to find the rate, use the rate. So in class problem number 1, the first thing that you need to do is find that predetermined overhead rate. So one rate, and again, the objective here is to find total overhead divided by some allocation base. That's how you get a rate. So to find the rate, we want Y over X, right? We want Y over X, where X is the estimated allocation base. So Y over X. So the overhead's given, right? It's given in pieces that we have to put together. And when we put those pieces together, we use this formula. Y is equal to the fixed overhead plus the variable overhead. Well, the fixed overhead is given. It's the 650,000. The variable overhead is the $3 per machine hour. And how many machine hours do we have? 100,000. So it's the fixed overhead of 650 plus the variable rate of 3 times 100,000 machine hours. Everything's up here. Fixed overhead of 650 plus the variable overhead of 3 times 100,000 machine hours. So we end up with total overhead of $950,000. Again, the fixed overhead, right, is given, the variable overhead rate is given, and our X is given. Put those three pieces together in this equation for Y is equal to A plus BX, and we get total overhead. The way we find the rate is by taking that total overhead, and you want to divide by X, that allocation base, which again is that 100,000. And we get our rate. The rate is $9.50 per machine hour. 9.50 per machine hour. So every time we can trace a machine hour to a job, we're going to assign overhead at the rate of $9.50. So that's number one. And then we have a job. And number two, we have job number 400. And we need to determine the total cost of the job and then the unit cost of the job. So the components in the cost of a job, the materials, the labor, and the applied overhead. So that's all we're going to do. The materials are traced, right? Materials are 450. The labor, well, the labor, we have hours, right? This is not the cost of labor. This is the total labor hours. And the direct labor wage rate is $21 per hour. So we can figure out the cost of that direct labor, again, because we know they work 10 hours and the wage rate is $21 an hour. So this is going to be the hours, 10 hours times that wage rate of $21. $21 an hour. So the cost of the labor, right, at 10 hours and $21 an hour, labor costs $210. That's where that comes from. Okay. So the materials are given. We got to add in that labor. So the materials plus the labor plus the overhead. How do we get the overhead? Well, we apply that overhead based on the rate of $9.50 times the allocation base. $9.50 times the allocation base, the actual activity. And it's 950 per machine hour. 950 per machine hour. And we've got 40 machine hours. Got 40 machine hours. So we want to multiply times the 40 machine hours. 950 times 40 machine hours. Well, that's where the 380 comes from. So the materials plus the labor plus the overhead gives us the total manufacturing cost of 1040. And we want it on a per unit basis. We're going to divide by the 52 units. So the total cost divided by 52 units gives us the cost per unit, $20 per unit. So that's a basic job costing problem where you have to, one, find the rate, two, use the rate, assign that overhead, come up with a total cost, divide by units, you got a cost per unit. And then I want to do one of these where you have two departments. And we want to be able to, again, find the total manufacturing cost for the job and then the unit cost for the job. So we have two rates that are given to us. The predetermined overhead rate in cutting is $7.50. So here we've got $7.50 per machine hour. So this department is per machine hour. And then the other department is 16.20 per labor hour. So this department is $16.20 per labor hour, per direct labor hour. That's important because now when we try to determine the total cost of this job, we've got to apply the overhead twice. This department, 750 a machine hour. This department is 16.20 per direct labor hour. So the total cost of the job, start with the cutting department. Trace the materials. They're given right there, 500. So we got 500 in materials, and we want to add that to the labor. The labor is 108. Trace the labor. So materials plus labor. And then we want to apply the overhead. How do we apply the overhead? It's 750 per machine hour. How many machine hours? We got 80 machine hours. So 750 times 80, that gives us $600 of applied overhead. So in the cutting department, we have materials that we can trace, labor that we can trace, and overhead that we've applied for a total cost in cutting of 1208. So that's the materials, labor, and overhead in the cutting department. In the finishing department, well, we can trace the materials, 310. So we trace the materials, we trace the labor, 360 of labor, and then we apply the overhead based on 1620 per labor hour. 1620 times the number of labor hours. Well, we're not given labor hours, but we can certainly figure it out because we know the finishing department has a cost of $360 in labor, and the labor has a rate of $18 per hour. The company's direct labor wage rate is $18 an hour. So we can always find out the number of hours by taking the total cost of the labor divided by the wage rate. So again, the labor cost is 360 and the wage rate is 18. 360 divided by 18, got it down here, gives us 20 direct labor hours. So we can apply that overhead here by taking 1620 times the 20 direct labor hours that we found down here. And that's the applied overhead for the finishing department. So the materials plus labor plus the overhead gives us the total cost in the finishing department. And the total cost of the job, well, we got to put all this together. So the total cost in cutting plus the total cost in finishing gives us a total for the job of 2202. And this job has 40 units. So if we divide by 40 units, then that gives us a cost per unit of $55.05. So that's job costing. And then we transitioned from job costing in chapter 3 to activity-based costing in chapter 5. And with activity-based costing, all we're doing is we are assigning costs based on tracing the materials stole, tracing the labor stole, but we apply the overhead using multiple rates. Instead of one rate or departmental rates, we use multiple rates or activity rates. And the way we find our activity rates is by taking the activity cost divided by the activity measure. That's how we get that activity rate. And then we can assign the overhead, right? In the same way we applied it in chapter 3. Take the rate times the activity. And if we want to know the total cost of however we define the cost object, a job, a product, a department, a customer, we just add all of the cost, right? We can apply the overhead, and then once we've applied the overhead, we can get an overhead cost per unit, right? Take the total overhead divided by the number of units. We can get a total cost by adding the materials, the labor, and the overhead. Put all those pieces together, and we've got a total cost. So a lot of what we did in chapter 5 was use activity-based costing to get the total overhead, divide by units to get overhead per unit. But then we also finished off the chapter by coming up with a total product cost, which is everything, materials plus labor plus overhead. Now, there are some pretty good examples, again, that you want to go back and work through. Exercise 510, 513, in-class problem number 2 and 3. And I'll just go through a couple problems here from chapter 5. So in chapter 5, we're just using activity-based costing. Chapter 5 in class number 2, activity-based costing, we've got 2 activities and 2 products. And what we need to do is find the overhead costs per unit. So we have to find the rate. How do we get a rate? Take the activity cost, right, for setup. The activity cost for setup is 107, and we want to divide by the activity measure, which is number of setups. And we want to make sure we use all the setups, right? So it's all the costs for that activity, the 107, divided by all the activity. 107 divided by that 100 gives us the activity rate of 1070. And then this activity is machine maintenance, and that's the 50,000, and we want to make sure we divide that by the number of machine hours. All of the machine hours, the 5,000 machine hours. So the $50,000 cost divided by the 5,000 machine hours gives us an activity rate of $10. So we have our rates, and then we apply the overhead by taking the rate times the activity. So for product A, we got our two rates, 1070 and $10, and we want to multiply times the activity. So we can trace 30 setups to product A. 1070 times 30 gives us 32,100. We can trace 1,200 machine hours to product A. $10 times 1,200 gives us $12,000. So the total manufacturing overhead is 44,1, right? Add all the assigned overhead, and we end up with the total overhead we've assigned. And if we want a unit cost, divide by the number of units, 350 units. Divide by the 350 units, and we have a cost per unit. Same thing for product B, right? We've got our rates, multiply the rate times the activity. 1070 times the 70 setups that we can trace to B. And that will give us assigned overhead of 74.9. And then $10 times the 3,800 machine hours we can trace to product B. That will give us a total cost of 38. Add all that overhead together for B, and we've got a total overhead cost of 112.9. And we want to make sure we divide by the 225 units, and then that will give us the cost per unit, in this case of 501.78. So that's an example where we're using activity-based costing to, one, find the rates, two, assign the overhead to get total overhead, divide by the number of units, and we've got that overhead per unit. And then the last one that I'm going to go through is a really good comprehensive problem because it kind of combines chapter 3 and chapter 5 together and forces you to, one, be able to use activity-based costing to assign the overhead, and then two, determine the total unit product cost. So that goes back to chapter 3. So the first thing we need to be able to do is assign that overhead. And once we've assigned the overhead, then we can come up with a unit product cost. So you don't have to find rates. The rates are already given. They're right here. So we have our activity rates given here. We just need to be able to use them to assign the overhead to these two products, the mid-fi and the high-fi, and then come up with a unit product cost. And remember, the unit product cost has to include materials plus labor plus overhead. So let's start with the overhead. We need the overhead on a per unit basis. So we'll use the rates. The rates are given 1,614. So the rates 1,614 multiplied times the activity. So here we have this first product, which is the mid-fi product. So I'll just put in a heading here, and I'm just going to abbreviate. This is the mid product, and this is the high product. So we can trace all of this activity, right? 36, 35, 1650, 36, 35, 1650, multiply times the rate. The rate times the activity is going to give us the allocation of that overhead using activity-based costing. So we've assigned the overhead 3 times using the 3 rates times the activity we can trace to this product. That's our overhead. Add them all up, right? This plus this plus this gives us the total overhead, manufacturing overhead, that we've assigned to this product. And if we want the overhead on a per unit basis, divide by the number of units, divide by the 75. So the overhead is 1068. Right? The overhead per unit, manufacturing overhead per unit is 1068 for this mid product. We'll do the same thing for the high product. These are the rates, right? 1,614. Here's all of our activity, the 36, 20, and 1450. Multiply the rate times the activity, rate times the activity, and that will give us the assignment of overhead. So we've assigned the overhead 36,000, 12,000, and 20,300. And then we want to add all of them, right? So this plus this plus this gives us that total overhead. Divide by 325 receivers, and that will give us the overhead on a per unit basis. So we're not done yet. We just have the overhead piece, right? We use the rates to assign the overhead, came up with total overhead, and then divide by the number of units, and we've got the overhead per unit. But again, what we need is the unit product cost. The unit product cost has three components: materials, labor, and overhead. We only have one of the three. We have the overhead on a per unit basis. We've got to add to that the materials and the labor. So we put those pieces together. I've got them down here. So the direct materials are given 500. The direct labor is given 300. We scroll back up here and point that out. Materials of 500, labor of 300. So the materials of 500, labor of 300, plus the overhead of 1068, right? Put all these pieces together, and that's the unit product cost. 500 a unit, 300 a unit, and 1068 a unit. Add it all together, and this is our answer. This is the total product cost, right? You need the product cost, not the overhead cost. You need the product cost. Overhead cost is just 1068, but the product cost is materials plus labor plus overhead, or 1868. And then we do the same thing for the high product, right? We need a product cost. That means we need the materials, the labor, and the overhead. Materials are 1200, labor is 200. These are the per unit costs. So the 1200 of materials, the 200 of labor, plus the 210.15 of overhead. Put it all together, and we've got a unit product cost of 1610.15. So good comprehensive problem because it forces you, one, to use activity-based costing from chapter 5, two, to find the unit product cost. That's chapter 3. So it kind of combines everything in a good summary. So again, the exam 2 will cover chapters 3 and 5, and there are 4 problems on the exam, and there's even coverage from chapters 3 and 5. Make sure you bring a calculator, a pencil, and I will see you for the scheduled exam on Wednesday. Take care. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. Bye.